How medieval peasants survived the coldest nights. Medieval Europe was a harsh place to live, especially for peasants who comprised over 90% of the population. Cold winters presented a genuine test of survival when temperatures could drop to -30 degrees Celsius, and heating was primitive at best. This extensive account draws from archaeological findings, medieval chronicles, court records, and surviving documents to tell the real stories of how ordinary people endured the most brutal winters in human history. The Great Winter of 1407 to 1408, a test of human endurance. One of the most severe winters in European history began in December 1407. The chronicler Jean de Troyes recorded that frosts were so intense that even wines froze solid in cellars. In the village of Chartres, France, a peasant named Pierre Dubois left behind a remarkable account through a legal document that survived in the archives of the Cathedral of Notre Dame. Pierre lived in a single-room cottage with his wife Marie, their 3 children, and his elderly mother. When the Great Freeze began on December 15th, 1407, Pierre had already prepared by gathering every scrap of wood he could find. Medieval peasants knew that survival depended on preparation, and Pierre had spent the entire autumn collecting fallen branches, buying bundles of kindling from the local lord's forest, and even trading his best hen for a cartload of peat. The cottage itself was typical of peasant dwellings, walls made of wattle and daub, woven sticks covered with mud, straw, and dung, with a thatched roof. There was no chimney, only a central hearth with a hole in the roof for smoke to escape. The floor was packed earth covered with rushes and straw that had to be changed regularly to prevent rot and vermin. When the temperature plummeted, Pierre's family employed a strategy that was common throughout medieval Europe. They consolidated into the smallest possible space. The entire family moved their sleeping arrangements to within 3 feet of the hearth. They dragged their straw mattresses, sheepskin blankets, and every piece of fabric they owned into this tight circle around the fire. Marie, following practices passed down through generations, heated stones in the fire during the day and wrapped them in cloth to place at the family's feet during the night. The children slept in the middle, with the adults forming a protective barrier around them. Pierre's mother, despite her age, contributed by staying awake for portions of the night to tend the fire, ensuring it never died completely. The family's survival strategy extended beyond just heat. They brought their livestock, 2 goats, a pig, and several chickens, into the cottage itself. This practice, documented in numerous medieval sources, served multiple purposes. The animals' body heat warmed the space, their lives were protected from the cold, and they were safe from wolves and other predators that became desperate during harsh winters. Pierre's account mentions that the family ate only once per day during the worst weeks, consuming a gruel made from barley, turnips, and whatever meat they could spare from their animals. They melted snow for drinking water as all the local wells and streams had frozen solid. The children's clothes were never removed during the coldest period. They slept, ate, and lived in the same layers of woolen tunics, leg wrappings, and cloaks. By the end of January 1408, Pierre recorded that they had burned through their entire winter store of fuel. In desperation, they began burning their wooden furniture, starting with stools, and eventually even parts of their bed frame. The family survived by huddling together under every available covering, sharing body heat in shifts and rationing their food to less than 500 calories per person per day. The famine winter of 1315 to 1316, when cold met starvation. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 was preceded by the harshest winter in living memory. Contemporary sources from across Europe describe scenes of unimaginable hardship. The Winchester Annals record that in Hampshire, England, peasants died of cold and hunger in numbers not seen since the Viking raids. In the village of Walsham-le-Willows in Suffolk, manor court rolls preserve the testimony of a peasant named William Shepherd, who described how his community survived the winter of 1315 to 1316. William's account, given during a legal proceeding about debts incurred during the famine, provides extraordinary detail about survival strategies. William's cottage housed 7 people: himself, his wife Agnes, their 4 children, ranging from age 4 to 16, and Agnes's sister, who had been widowed the previous year. The cottage was larger than Pierre's, with 2 rooms, but it was still cramped when everyone gathered around the single hearth. The family's preparation for winter had been hampered by the terrible harvest of 1315. They had managed to store only about half their usual grain supply, and their stockpile of firewood was similarly reduced because William had been forced to work extra days on the Lord's domain land instead of gathering fuel for his own family. When the worst cold struck in January 1316, William's family employed a rotation system for staying warm. During the day, the older children would take turns going outside to gather any combustible materials they could find: dead leaves, animal dung, scraps of thatch blown from roofs. They would return to the cottage for warming periods, during which they would share their body heat with the younger children. Agnes and her sister developed an ingenious system for conserving heat while cooking. They would heat large stones in the fire, then wrap them in cloth and place them inside a wooden chest lined with sheepskins. The younger children would sit inside this improvised warming box while the women prepared what little food they had. The family's diet during this period consisted mainly of bread made from a mixture of grain, ground acorns, and bark from birch trees. William's account describes making a soup from bones that had been boiled multiple times, adding wild herbs and roots that Agnes knew to be edible. They also ate porridge made from oats that had been saved for the animals, mixed with melted snow and whatever vegetables they had managed to preserve. One of the most remarkable aspects of William's testimony is his description of the community cooperation that developed during the crisis. Neighbours would take turns hosting warming parties, where several families would crowd into the cottage with the best stocked fire. Children would be passed from family to family to ensure that the youngest and weakest received the most warmth. The village also organised communal fuel gathering expeditions. Groups of peasants would venture together into the Lord's forest, technically illegally, to gather fallen wood. They developed a system where lookouts would watch for the Lord's foresters, while others quickly gathered fuel. If caught, they faced severe punishment, but the alternative was death from cold. William's family survived the winter, though his youngest child, a boy of 4, died of what was likely pneumonia in February 1316. The manor court records show that this was tragically common. Child mortality rates during the winter of 1315 to 1316 were estimated at over 40% in some villages. The Thames Freeze of 1434, London's Peasants and Urban Survival. The winter of 1434 was so severe that the Thames River froze solid from London Bridge to Greenwich. This event, recorded in multiple contemporary sources including the Chronicle of London and the Brute Chronicle, created unique challenges for the urban poor, who lived very different lives from their rural counterparts. In the slums of Southwark, across the river from London proper, lived a community of landless peasants who had migrated to the city seeking work. These people, often called masterless men in contemporary documents, lived in conditions that were arguably worse than their rural counterparts. They had no land to provide food, no animals for warmth, and no established community support systems. The story of Thomas Miller, a former peasant from Yorkshire who had come to London after losing his land to sheep farming, illustrates the unique challenges faced by urban poor during extreme winters. Thomas's story survives in the records of the Southwark Priory, where he sought sanctuary during the worst of the cold. Thomas lived in a cellar beneath a baker's shop with 6 other men. The space was about 12 feet by 8 feet, with the ceiling so low that a man of average height could not stand upright. There was no hearth, no window, and no door, only a trapdoor that led to the baker's shop above. The men paid rent by doing odd jobs for the baker and by scavenging materials from the Thames mudflats. When the Thames froze, Thomas and his companions faced a crisis. Their primary source of income, scavenging coal, wood, and other materials from the river, was cut off. The baker, struggling with his own costs, could no longer afford to keep them in exchange for work. The men were faced with the choice of leaving their shelter to seek work elsewhere or finding ways to survive without income. Thomas's group developed a remarkable survival strategy based on urban scavenging and mutual cooperation. During the day, they would venture out in pairs to search for fuel in the form of discarded wood, paper, cloth, and even animal dung from the streets. They learned to identify which types of waste would burn and which would produce dangerous smoke in their confined space. The men created a heating system using a metal pot stolen from a tavern. They would burn small amounts of fuel in the pot, which provided both heat and light. They discovered that mixing wet materials with dry ones created a slower burning, longer lasting fire that was crucial for their survival. Food became their greatest challenge. The men survived primarily on scraps from taverns and the households of the wealthy. They would wait outside great houses during mealtimes, hoping to receive leftovers. Thomas's account describes eating bread crusts soaked in ale, vegetable peelings, and occasionally bones with small amounts of meat still attached. The group also developed a system for sharing body heat that was adapted to their cramped living conditions. They would lie in a row, with the weakest or coldest man in the center and the others arranged around him. They would rotate positions throughout the night to ensure everyone received time in the warmest spots. One of the most ingenious aspects of their survival was their use of the frozen Thames itself. The men discovered that they could chip ice from the river and melt it for drinking water, saving money they would otherwise have spent on ale or water from vendors. They also learned to fish through holes in the ice, using hooks made from bent nails and lines made from unraveled rope. The urban poor also had access to resources unavailable to rural peasants. Churches provided occasional shelter and food, and the city's waste created opportunities for scavenging. Thomas's group learned to follow the city's waste disposal patterns, knowing where and when different types of useful materials would be discarded. Thomas survived the winter of 1434, but two of his companions did not. One died of what was likely dysentery caused by contaminated water, and another simply disappeared one night and was never seen again. The survivors continued their precarious existence until spring, when the Thames thawed and they could resume their scavenging activities. The Scottish Highlands, 1363. Survival at the edge of the world. The winter of 1363 brought exceptional hardship to the Scottish Highlands, where peasants faced not only extreme cold, but also the constant threat of violence from clan warfare. The Chronicle of John of Fordun describes this winter as one in which men and beasts perished alike, and the very stones seemed to crack with cold. In the remote glen of Strathspey, a small community of Highland peasants faced the winter with resources that were meagre even by medieval standards. These people, known as cottars, lived in structures that were even more primitive than those of their southern counterparts. Their homes, called black houses, were built without mortar, using only stones fitted together and sealed with moss and mud. The story of Morag MacLeod, a widow with 3 children, illustrates the extreme measures required for survival in this harsh environment. Morag's story is preserved in the oral traditions of the MacLeod clan and was later recorded by a 16th century clan historian. Morag lived with her children, 2 boys aged 10 and 14, and a girl of 8, in a black house that measured roughly 20 feet by 12 feet. The house was divided into 2 sections, one for the family and one for their animals, which consisted of 2 Highland cattle, several sheep, and a few chickens. There was no separation between the 2 areas except for a low stone wall. The Highland winter began early in 1363, with snow falling in October and temperatures dropping well below freezing by November. Morag's family faced unique challenges that were specific to their environment. The high altitude and exposure to Atlantic storms meant that weather conditions could change rapidly and violently. The family had to be prepared for sudden blizzards that could last for days. Morag's survival strategy centered around the Highland tradition of winter sharing. The small community of about 30 people would consolidate into just a few houses during the worst weather. Morag's house became one of these centers because it was slightly larger than most and because she had successfully maintained a good relationship with her neighbors, despite being a widow. During the worst storms, as many as 15 people would crowd into Morag's house. The adults would sleep sitting up, leaning against the walls, while the children would lie on the floor in the center of the room, covered with every available piece of clothing and blanket. The animals provided crucial warmth, and the humans would actually sleep alongside the cattle during the coldest nights. The Highland diet during winter was particularly harsh. The community survived mainly on oatmeal porridge, dried meat, and a type of blood pudding made from cattle blood mixed with oatmeal. Morag's family also ate a traditional Highland food called sowans, which was made from oat husks that had been soaked in water for several days until they fermented. This provided essential nutrients and was filling despite containing very little actual food value. Water was a constant problem during the Highland winter. streams would freeze solid, and the community had to melt snow or chip ice for drinking water. Morag developed a system where she would fill every available container with snow during blizzards, then melt it gradually throughout the day to provide water for both humans and animals. The Highland peasants also faced the unique challenge of protecting their livestock from wolves and other predators. Morag's community organised night watches, with men taking turns to guard the animals and watch for signs of danger. They would build large fires outside their houses, not just for warmth, but also to keep predators away. One of the most remarkable aspects of Highland survival was their use of storytelling and music to maintain morale during the long, dark nights. Morag was known in her community as a skilled storyteller, and she would recite traditional tales and legends to help pass the time and keep spirits up during the worst weather. These sessions also served a practical purpose. They encouraged people to stay awake and alert, which helped prevent the hypothermia that could result from falling asleep in the cold. The Highland winter of 1363 was so severe that it became legendary in clan history. Morag's family survived, but the community lost nearly a third of its population to cold, hunger, and disease. The survivors had to completely rebuild their community the following spring, taking in orphaned children and redistributing the resources of those who had died. The German Peasant Wars era. Winter survival. During social upheaval, 1524 to 1525. The winter of 1524 to 1525 was particularly harsh across the German states, and it coincided with the social upheaval that would become known as the German Peasant Wars. This combination of extreme weather and social disorder created unique survival challenges for peasant communities throughout the Holy Roman Empire. In the village of Mühlhausen in Thuringia, a peasant named Hans Müller left behind a detailed account of his family's survival during this tumultuous period. Hans's story is preserved in the town records because he later became a leader in the peasant uprising and was eventually executed for his role in the rebellion. Hans lived with his extended family in a larger cottage that housed 12 people. Himself, his wife Greta, their 5 children, his brother Klaus with his wife and 2 children, and Hans's elderly parents. The cottage was built in the typical German style, with thick timber walls and a steep pitched roof designed to shed snow. The winter began normally enough, but by December 1524, it became clear that this would be an exceptionally harsh season. Hans's account describes temperatures so low that beer froze in the taverns and livestock died in their stalls despite being sheltered. The family's survival strategy was complicated by the social tensions that were building throughout the region. The peasants of Mühlhausen were already angry about increased taxes and feudal obligations imposed by their lord, Count Wilhelm von Henneberg. When the extreme weather began to threaten their survival, these tensions boiled over into acts of desperation that would later contribute to the peasant uprising. Hans's family implemented a strict rationing system from the beginning of December. They calculated their stores of grain, preserved meat and fuel, and determined that they would need to reduce their consumption to about 60% of normal levels to last through the winter. This meant that adults would eat only 1 substantial meal per day, while children would receive 2 smaller portions. The family's cottage was designed with a large central hearth that could accommodate substantial logs. Hans and Klaus had spent much of the previous summer and autumn cutting and storing wood, but they quickly realized that their supply would not last through an extended harsh winter. They began supplementing their wood with other combustible materials, furniture that was not absolutely necessary, wooden tools that could be replaced in spring, and even some of their roof thatch. One of the most innovative aspects of Hans's survival strategy was his use of the cottage's cellar. The family had dug a deep cellar beneath their house for storing vegetables and grain. During the worst cold, they would retreat into this underground space during the day as it remained warmer than the main house. They would bring hot stones from the hearth down into the cellar and huddle together for warmth. The social upheaval of the period affected survival in unexpected ways. Hans's account describes how traditional community cooperation began to break down as resources became scarce. Neighbors who had previously shared fuel and food began hoarding their supplies. The local miller, who had traditionally provided grain to poor families during harsh winters, began demanding payment in advance. These tensions led to acts of desperation that foreshadowed the coming rebellion. Hans and several other peasants broke into the Count's granary and stole grain to feed their families. They also illegally cut wood from the Lord's forest, actions that would normally result in severe punishment. The local authorities, however, were overwhelmed by the scale of the crisis and could not effectively enforce the law. The family's diet during this period was typical of German peasant survival food. They ate a lot of sauerkraut, which provided essential vitamins and could be stored for long periods. They made bread from a mixture of grain and ground acorns, supplemented with whatever vegetables they had managed to preserve. Hans's account mentions eating a soup made from bones that had been boiled multiple times, similar to the practices described in other regions. The German peasants also had access to beer, which was safer to drink than water and provided calories and nutrients. Hans's family brewed a weak beer from grain and consumed it throughout the winter. They also made a warm drink from heated beer mixed with eggs and spices, which provided both warmth and nutrition. The most remarkable aspect of Hans's survival story is how the extreme winter conditions contributed to the revolutionary fervor that would explode into open rebellion the following spring. Hans's account describes how the shared suffering of the winter created a sense of common cause among the peasants. Families that had previously accepted their feudal obligations began to question why they should suffer, while their lords remained comfortable in heated castles. The winter of 1524 to 1525 claimed many lives in Mühlhausen, but Hans's family survived intact. By spring, Hans had become a leader in the peasant movement, using his experience of organizing survival efforts during the winter to help coordinate the uprising. His story illustrates how extreme weather could catalyze social change, as communities that had learned to cooperate for survival began to envision more fundamental changes to their social order. The Little Ice Age, adaptation and innovation, 1550 to 1650. The period known as the Little Ice Age brought consistently harsh winters to Europe for over a century. During this time, peasant communities developed increasingly sophisticated survival strategies based on generations of accumulated experience. The winter of 1565 in the Netherlands provides an excellent example of how peasant communities adapted to these challenging conditions. in the village of Volendam, north of Amsterdam, a fishing community faced the challenge of surviving when their primary livelihood, fishing in the Zuiderzee, became impossible due to thick ice. The village records, preserved in the North Holland archives, contain detailed accounts of how the community adapted to this crisis. The story of Peter van der Meer, a fisherman and small farmer, illustrates the innovative approaches that peasant communities developed during the Little Ice Age. Peter's account survives in a legal document related to a property dispute, but it provides remarkable detail about survival strategies during extreme weather. Peter's household consisted of his wife Marijn, their 4 children, and his father-in-law, an elderly man named Jan, who had been a carpenter before arthritis made it impossible for him to work. The family lived in a typical Dutch peasant house with thick walls and small windows designed to conserve heat. The Dutch peasants had developed some of the most sophisticated heating systems in medieval Europe. Peter's house featured a complex system of interconnected stoves that could heat multiple rooms from a single fire. The main stove was built into the wall between the kitchen and the main living area, allowing heat to warm both spaces simultaneously. The family's preparation for winter was more systematic than what we see in other regions. Beginning in August, they would begin collecting and processing fuel for the winter. This included not only wood, but also peat, which was abundant in the Dutch lowlands. Peat provided a steady, long-burning fuel that was particularly valuable during extended cold periods. Peter's family also developed an innovative approach to food preservation that went beyond the simple techniques used in other regions. They used the consistent cold temperatures to create a kind of natural refrigeration system. They would dig pits in the ground and line them with straw and ice, creating spaces where meat and fish could be stored for extended periods without spoiling. The Dutch peasants were also more likely to live in multi-family houses, which provided better opportunities for sharing resources and heat. Peter's household shared their building with 2 other families, creating a community of about 15 people who could pool their resources for survival. When the Zuiderzee froze in December 1565, Peter and the other fishermen faced a crisis. Their boats were trapped in ice, and their primary source of income was eliminated. However, the community quickly adapted by developing alternative survival strategies. The men organized ice fishing expeditions, cutting holes in the frozen sea, and using techniques that had been developed over generations of harsh winters. They would build small shelters around the fishing holes, using snow and ice blocks, creating windbreaks that allowed them to fish even in severe weather. The women of the community developed a cottage industry producing woolen goods for sale in Amsterdam. They would spin and weave during the long winter nights, creating products that could be traded for food and other necessities. This work was done in communal sessions where several families would gather in the warmest house, sharing heat and light while working. The Dutch peasants also developed sophisticated food distribution systems during harsh winters. The community would pool their resources and create communal kitchens where large meals could be prepared more efficiently than individual family cooking. This system ensured that everyone received adequate nutrition and that fuel was used as efficiently as possible. Peter's account describes a remarkable level of community organization during the crisis. The village appointed a council of elders who would make decisions about resource allocation and coordinate survival efforts. They developed detailed plans for fuel distribution, food rationing, and work assignments that ensured the community's survival. The Dutch also had access to some resources that were unavailable to peasants in other regions. The proximity to Amsterdam meant that they could sometimes trade for imported goods, including grain from the Baltic region and fuel from Germany. However, these trades were expensive and risky during winter conditions. The winter of 1565 was survived by most of the Volendam community, but it required fundamental changes in how they lived and worked. The experience led to permanent changes in the community's organization, with the establishment of formal mutual aid societies and more sophisticated food storage systems. The English peasant experience, court records and survival, 1434 to 1435. The winter of 1434 to 1435 in England was notable not only for its severity, but also for the detailed records that survive in manor court rolls and other legal documents. These sources provide an unusually clear picture of how English peasants survived extreme weather conditions. The manor of Waltham Holy Cross in Essex provides particularly rich documentation of peasant survival strategies during this harsh winter. The manor court rolls, preserved in the National Archives, contain numerous cases related to survival activities during the winter months. The story of John Carpenter, a villain-bound peasant on the Waltham estate, emerges from these legal records. John was brought before the manor court in April 1435 on charges of stealing wood from the Lord's forest, but his testimony provides detailed information about his family's survival during the winter. John lived with his wife Alice, their 3 children, and his widowed sister in a cottage that was typical of English peasant dwellings. The house was built with a timber frame filled with wattle and daub, and it featured a central hearth with no chimney. The family had use of about 3 acres of land, which provided most of their food during normal years. The winter of 1434 to 1435 began early, with snow falling in November and continuing intermittently through March. John's testimony describes how his family's survival strategy was based on careful preparation and strict rationing of resources. The family had spent the autumn months preserving food using traditional English techniques. They salted pork from their pig, pickled vegetables in wooden barrels, and stored grain in sealed containers to protect it from rodents. They also gathered wild foods that could be preserved, including nuts, berries, and herbs that could be dried and stored for winter use. John's cottage was heated by a central fire that burned continuously throughout the winter. The family had collected wood during the summer and autumn, but they supplemented this with other combustible materials. They burned straw from their grain harvest, dried animal dung, and even old clothing that could no longer be repaired. The English peasants had developed a sophisticated understanding of nutrition during harsh winters. Alice prepared meals that were designed to provide maximum nutrition from limited resources. She made a type of bread that included not only grain, but also ground beans, peas, and even tree bark during the worst periods. The family's daily routine during the winter was carefully structured to conserve heat and energy. They would wake before dawn to tend the fire and prepare a warm meal. The children would remain close to the hearth during the day, while the adults would venture outside only when necessary to care for animals or gather fuel. One of the most interesting aspects of John's testimony is his description of community cooperation during the crisis. The peasants of Waltham had developed informal networks for sharing resources and supporting families in need. When John's family began to run low on food in February, neighbours provided grain and other supplies in exchange for future labour. The legal records also reveal the tensions that extreme weather created within peasant communities. John's case of wood theft was not unusual. The court records show numerous cases of peasants stealing fuel, food, and other necessities during the winter. The manor lord's officials struggled to maintain order while also recognizing the legitimate needs of their tenants. The English peasants also had access to resources through the church, which provided both spiritual and material support during crises. The parish church of Waltham Holy Cross maintained stores of grain and other supplies specifically for distribution to poor families during harsh winters. The church records show that John's family received assistance on several occasions. The most remarkable aspect of the English peasant experience was the legal framework that governed survival activities. The manor court rolls show that while theft was prosecuted, penalties were often reduced or suspended when the theft was clearly motivated by survival needs. This suggests a sophisticated understanding of the relationship between extreme weather and social stability. John's family survived the winter of 1434 to 1435, though they entered the spring with depleted resources and significant debts to their neighbours. The experience led to changes in the manor's policies regarding fuel collection and food distribution during emergencies, showing how individual survival stories could influence broader social practices. Conclusion: lessons from medieval survival. The stories of medieval peasants surviving extreme winters reveal remarkable human resilience and ingenuity. Despite facing conditions that would challenge even modern survival experts, these communities developed sophisticated strategies for maintaining life during the harshest weather. Common themes emerge from these diverse experiences. Successful survival required careful preparation, beginning months before winter arrived. Communities that survived intact were those that maintained strong social bonds and cooperative networks. Innovation and adaptation were essential, as traditional methods often proved inadequate during extreme conditions. The medieval peasant experience also demonstrates the importance of local knowledge and community wisdom. Survival strategies were passed down through generations and continuously refined based on experience. These communities understood their local environment intimately and could adapt quickly to changing conditions. Perhaps most importantly, these stories show that survival was rarely an individual effort. The peasants who survived the harshest winters did so as part of communities that shared resources, knowledge, and risks. Their experiences provide valuable insights into human resilience and the importance of social cooperation during times of crisis. The harsh winters of medieval Europe tested human endurance to its limits, but they also revealed the remarkable capacity of ordinary people to adapt, innovate, and survive under the most challenging conditions. These stories, preserved in chronicles, court records, and oral traditions, continue to offer lessons about resilience, community, and the human spirit in the face of adversity. Through archaeological evidence, historical documents, and surviving accounts, we can see how medieval peasants transformed their homes into survival shelters, their communities into mutual aid networks, and their traditional knowledge into life-saving innovations. Their stories remind us that survival is not just about individual strength or resources, but about the bonds that hold communities together and the wisdom that comes from generations of experience facing life's greatest challenges. The legacy of these medieval survivors lives on in the rural communities that still exist across Europe, many of which maintain traditions and practices that originated during those harsh winters centuries ago. Their experiences demonstrate that human beings possess a remarkable capacity to adapt and survive, even under conditions that seem impossible to endure. The Icelandic Cod Wars, Winter, Survival at the Edge of Civilization, 1348 to 1349. The winter of 1348 to 1349 in Iceland was particularly brutal, made worse by the fact that the island was simultaneously dealing with the first waves of the Black Death. The Icelandic annals record this as the winter when both cold and death stalked the land together. The story of Björn Einarsson, a farmer and fisherman from the Vestfjords, provides a remarkable account of survival in one of Europe's most hostile environments. Björn lived on a small farm called Hvamur with his wife Gudrun, their 5 children, 2 elderly parents, and 3 servants. The farm was located in a remote fjord, where the nearest neighbour was a day's journey away. The isolation that normally provided protection from raiders and disease now became a deadly trap when the harsh winter began in October 1348. The Icelandic peasants faced unique challenges that set them apart from their European counterparts. The short growing season meant that they were entirely dependent on preserved food for 8 months of the year. Their diet consisted mainly of dried fish, fermented shark meat, preserved lamb, and dairy products that could be stored in the cold climate. Björn's farmhouse was built in the traditional Icelandic style, constructed partially underground with thick stone walls and a roof made of layered turf. The design was specifically adapted to the harsh climate, with the earth providing natural insulation. The main living area was heated by a long hearth that ran down the center of the room, with sleeping alcoves arranged along the walls. When the winter began with unprecedented ferocity in October 1348, Björn's family found themselves trapped by blizzards that lasted for weeks at a time. The Icelandic sources describe winds so strong that they could knock a man down and snow so deep that it covered the roofs of houses. The family's survival depended on their ability to remain completely self-sufficient for months at a time. The Icelanders had developed perhaps the most sophisticated food preservation techniques in medieval Europe. Björn's family had spent the summer months preparing for winter by smoking and drying fish, fermenting shark meat in underground pits, and preserving lamb in salt and whey. They also collected and dried seaweed, which provided essential vitamins during the long winter months. The family's daily routine was strictly regulated to conserve both food and fuel. They ate only 2 meals per day, consisting mainly of dried fish, fermented dairy products, and a thin gruel made from barley and seaweed. Fresh food was limited to occasional eggs from their chickens and milk from their few surviving cows. Fuel was a constant concern in Iceland, where trees were scarce and wood had to be imported or gathered as driftwood from the beaches. Björn's family burned dried sheep dung, whale oil when available, and carefully hoarded pieces of driftwood that had been collected during the summer. They also burned dried seaweed and peat, which provided steady heat, but created thick smoke that filled their underground dwelling. The Icelandic winter darkness was perhaps the most challenging aspect of their survival. From November through February, the sun barely appeared above the horizon, creating a psychological challenge that was as difficult as the physical hardships. Björn's account, preserved in the saga of the Visfjords, describes how the family maintained their sanity through storytelling, singing, and the recitation of traditional poems. The family's survival strategy included bringing all their livestock into the farmhouse. The main room housed not only the 11 humans but also their sheep, cattle, and chickens. The animals provided crucial warmth and were essential for survival, but they also created problems with sanitation and air quality in the confined space. One of the most remarkable aspects of Icelandic survival was their use of geothermal energy. Björn's farm was located near natural hot springs, which the family used for washing, cooking, and heating. They built a system of channels to direct hot water from the springs into their house, creating a primitive but effective heating system that supplemented their fires. The winter of 1348 to 1349 was made even more challenging by the arrival of the Black Death. The plague reached Iceland in the autumn of 1348, and Björn's family had to deal with both extreme cold and the threat of disease. They implemented strict quarantine measures, avoiding all contact with outsiders and burning the clothes and possessions of anyone who showed signs of illness. The psychological challenges of the Icelandic winter were addressed through community traditions that had been developed over centuries. Even though families were isolated by the weather, they maintained contact through a complex system of signals and messages. Björn's family would light signal fires on clear nights to communicate with distant neighbors, using a code that could convey basic information about their condition. The Icelandic diet during winter included some foods that would seem strange to modern tastes, but were essential for survival. They ate fermented shark meat, which provided protein and could be stored for months. They also consumed a dish called slatur, made from sheep's blood mixed with fat and grain, which was rich in iron and calories. Dried fish was eaten with butter or whale oil to provide essential fats. The family's clothing was specially adapted to the extreme conditions. They wore multiple layers of wool, with outer garments made from sheepskin and sealskin. They also wore special boots made from sealskin that were waterproof and provided insulation against the cold ground. The women spent much of the winter spinning and weaving wool to repair and replace clothing that was damaged by the harsh conditions. Björn's account describes several near-death experiences during the winter. In January 1349, the family almost died from carbon monoxide poisoning when their ventilation system became blocked by snow. They survived only because one of the children woke up feeling sick and alerted the adults to the danger. In February, they nearly ran out of food when a storage pit was destroyed by frost, but they survived by reducing their rations to starvation levels. The Icelandic peasants had developed a unique understanding of weather patterns that allowed them to predict and prepare for the worst conditions. Björn's family used traditional knowledge about wind patterns, cloud formations, and animal behavior to anticipate severe weather. This knowledge was passed down through generations and was essential for survival in such a harsh environment. The winter of 1348 to 1349 claimed the lives of an estimated 60% of Iceland's population, making it one of the most devastating winters in the island's history. Björn's family survived, but they lost both elderly parents and one of their children to a combination of cold, hunger, and disease. The survivors had to completely rebuild their community the following spring, taking in orphan children and redistributing resources from abandoned farms. The Carpathian Mountain Experience, Romanian Peasants and Alpine Survival, 1431 to 1432. The winter of 1431 to 1432 in the Carpathian Mountains of Wallachia, modern-day Romania, was recorded in the chronicle of the Cantacuzino family as the winter when the wolves came down from the mountains and the cold came up from hell. This period provides insight into how peasants survived in one of Europe's most challenging mountain environments. The story of Radu Fierarol, Radu the blacksmith, a peasant from a small village called Ramniku in the Carpathian foothills, illustrates the unique challenges faced by mountain communities during extreme winters. Radu's account survives in the records of the monastery of Kozia, where he sought refuge during the worst of the winter. Radu lived with his extended family in a fortified compound that housed 23 people, his own family of 7, his brother's family of 8, and 8 other relatives and servants. The compound was built like a small fortress with thick wooden walls and a central courtyard, designed to provide protection from both the weather and the frequent raids by Hungarian and Ottoman forces. The Carpathian peasants faced unique challenges that combined the difficulties of mountain living with the constant threat of warfare. Their survival strategies had to account for both natural and human dangers. The community had developed a complex system of hidden food stores and emergency shelters that could be used if they were forced to flee their homes. The winter began with heavy snows in November 1431, but the real crisis came in December when a series of blizzards trapped the community in their compound for over a month. Radu's account describes snow so deep that it covered the roofs of their buildings and created a landscape where familiar landmarks disappeared entirely. The family's survival strategy was based on the principle of thermal layering. They consolidated into the smallest possible heated space during the worst weather. The central hall of their compound could be heated by a large stone stove that burned continuously. During blizzards, all 23 people would crowd into this single room, sleeping in shifts and sharing body heat. The Carpathian diet during winter was heavily dependent on preserved meats and dairy products. Radu's family had slaughtered most of their livestock in the autumn and preserved the meat through smoking, salting, and freezing. They also made a type of cheese that could be aged in caves, providing protein throughout the winter months. The mountain environment provided some unique resources for survival. The family collected and stored large quantities of pine nuts, which provided essential fats and calories. They also gathered mushrooms during the autumn and dried them for winter use. The mountains provided access to certain medicinal plants that could be used to treat the illnesses that are common during harsh winters. One of the most remarkable aspects of Carpathian survival was the use of natural caves as emergency shelters. Radu's community had prepared several caves in the nearby mountains with supplies and equipment that could sustain them if their main compound became uninhabitable. These caves maintained a constant temperature year-round and provided protection from the wind and snow. The family's heating system was more sophisticated than those used in other regions. They had built a network of stone channels under the floors of their buildings that could carry hot air from the central fire to different rooms. This system, similar to the Roman hypocaust, allowed them to heat multiple spaces efficiently and provided more comfortable living conditions during the long winter months. The Carpathian peasants had developed specialized clothing for mountain survival. They wore multiple layers of wool and fur, with outer garments made from sheepskin and bear hide. They also wore special boots lined with felt and fur that provided insulation against the frozen ground. The women spent much of the winter creating and repairing these essential garments. Water was a constant challenge in the mountains during winter. While lowland peasants could melt snow for drinking water, the Carpathian community had to deal with the problem of contaminated mountain snow and ice. They developed a sophisticated filtration system using layers of cloth, charcoal, and sand to purify water from mountain streams and snow. The winter of 1431 to 1432 was made more dangerous by the presence of wolves and bears that were driven down from the higher mountains by the extreme cold. Radu's account describes several attacks on their compound by hungry wolves, which forced the community to maintain armed guards throughout the winter. They also had to protect their remaining livestock from predators, which required constant vigilance. The mountain community had developed a sophisticated communication system using horn signals and smoke signals to maintain contact with neighboring villages during winter. This system allowed them to coordinate hunting expeditions, share information about weather conditions, and call for help during emergencies. The signals could be transmitted across vast distances through the mountain valleys. The Carpathian peasants also had to deal with the threat of avalanches, which were common during heavy snow periods. Radu's family had built their compound in a location that was protected from avalanche paths, but they still had to be constantly aware of the danger. They developed techniques for recognizing avalanche conditions and had emergency procedures for evacuating their buildings if necessary. The family's survival during the winter of 1431 to 1432 was aided by their relationship with the monastery of Kosea, which provided both spiritual and material support during the crisis. The monastery had extensive stores of grain and other supplies that could be distributed to peasant communities during emergencies. The monks also provided medical care and spiritual guidance that helped maintain morale during the darkest months. The most challenging aspect of Carpathian survival was the psychological impact of complete isolation during blizzards. Radu's account describes periods when the family was trapped in their compound for weeks at a time, with no contact with the outside world. They maintained their sanity through religious observances, storytelling, and the practice of traditional crafts that kept their hands and minds occupied. The winter of 1431 to 1432 claimed the lives of about 40% of the population in Radu's region, but his extended family survived intact. The experience led to changes in how the community prepared for winter, including the construction of additional emergency shelters and the development of more sophisticated food preservation techniques. The Venetian Lagoon, Urban Island Survival, 1458 to 1459. The winter of 1458 to 1459 in Venice was exceptional, not only for its severity, but also for the unique challenges it presented to an urban population living on islands in a lagoon. The Venetian chronicler Marine Sanudo recorded this as the winter when the lagoon became a field of ice and the city became a prison of cold. The story of Marco Pescatore, a fisherman living on the island of Murano, provides insight into how Venice's poor survived when their water-based economy was frozen solid. Marco's account survives in the records of the Scuola Grande di San Marco, a confraternity that provided aid to the poor during emergencies. Marco lived with his family in a small house on Murano that was typical of working-class Venetian dwellings. The house was built on stilts above the water, with thick brick walls and small windows designed to conserve heat. The family consisted of Marco, his wife Caterina, their 4 children, and Marco's elderly mother, who helped with childcare and household tasks. The Venetian poor faced unique challenges during harsh winters. Unlike rural peasants who could supplement their diets with preserved foods from their own land, urban Venetians were dependent on imported food and the lagoon's resources. When the lagoon froze, both fishing and trade became impossible, cutting off the city's primary sources of food and income. The winter began with unusual cold in December 1458, but the real crisis came in January when the entire lagoon froze solid. Marco's account describes ice so thick that people could walk from island to island, something that had never been seen before in living memory. The frozen lagoon created both opportunities and dangers for the city's residents. Marco's family had prepared for winter by storing dried fish, grain, and other preserved foods in their house. However, their preparations were based on normal winter conditions, not the extreme cold that actually occurred. When the lagoon froze, they were cut off from their normal sources of income and had to find new ways to survive. The family's survival strategy was based on adaptation and innovation. When fishing became impossible, Marco learned to hunt birds and small animals on the frozen lagoon. He also discovered that he could dig through the ice to reach shellfish and other marine life that were trapped below. This required new skills and tools that he had to develop quickly. The Venetian poor had access to resources that were unique to their urban environment. The city's numerous churches provided shelter and food to the needy, and the scuole, confraternities, maintained stores of grain and other supplies for distribution during emergencies. Marco's family received aid from the Scuola Grande di San Marco on several occasions during the winter. The family's house was heated by a central fireplace that burned wood imported from the mainland. However, the extreme cold made it impossible to obtain new supplies of fuel, and the family had to burn furniture and other household items to stay warm. They also learned to use charcoal and oil lamps more efficiently to provide heat while conserving fuel. The frozen lagoon created new opportunities for survival. Marco's family learned to travel across the ice to reach the mainland, where they could gather wood and other supplies that were not available on the islands. They also participated in a barter economy that developed during the crisis. trading fish and other goods for grain and fuel. One of the most remarkable aspects of Venetian survival was the way the city's unique architecture was adapted for extreme cold. The family sealed their windows with cloth and wax to prevent heat loss. And they created a smaller living space within their house by hanging heavy curtains around the fireplace. This reduced the volume of space they needed to heat while providing better insulation. The Venetian diet during the winter was adapted to the available resources. The family ate mainly dried fish, bread, and a type of soup made from beans and preserved vegetables. They also consumed wine, which was both nutritious and helped them stay warm. The city's bakeries continued to operate during the crisis, providing bread to those who could afford it. The winter of 1458 to 1459 was particularly challenging because it coincided with political tensions between Venice and the Ottoman Empire. The city was under a partial blockade, which made it even more difficult to obtain supplies from the mainland. Marco's family, like many other Venetians, had to deal with both natural and political challenges simultaneously. The family's survival was aided by the strong sense of community that existed among Venice's poor. Neighbors shared resources and helped each other with daily tasks like gathering fuel and preparing food. The city's unique layout, with its network of canals and bridges, actually helped during the crisis by allowing people to travel more easily once the waterways froze. The psychological challenges of the Venetian winter were addressed through the city's rich cultural traditions. Marco's family participated in religious observances and community gatherings that helped maintain morale during the darkest months. The city's numerous churches provided not only physical shelter, but also spiritual comfort to those struggling with the crisis. The winter of 1458 to 1459 claimed many lives in Venice, but Marco's family survived intact. The experience led to changes in how the city prepared for winter emergencies, including the establishment of larger food stores and the development of better heating systems for public buildings. The crisis also strengthened the city's network of charitable organizations, which became more effective at providing aid during future emergencies. The Welsh borderlands. Survival during the War of the Roses, 1461 to 1462. The winter of 1461 to 1462 in the Welsh borderlands was particularly harsh, coinciding with the brutal conflict known as the War of the Roses. The Chronicle of Llanthony Priory records this as the winter when war and weather together brought death to the valleys. The story of Gwilym ap Rhys, a Welsh peasant from a village near Abergavenny, illustrates how ordinary people survived when caught between natural disasters and human conflict. Gwilym lived with his extended family in a traditional Welsh longhouse that sheltered 15 people. His own family of 6, his brother's family of 5, and 4 elderly relatives. The house was built in the ancient Celtic style, with thick stone walls and a thatched roof, designed to withstand both weather and potential attacks from raiders. The Welsh borderlands were particularly vulnerable during the War of the Roses because they lay between territories controlled by different factions. Gwilym's village had been raided twice during the autumn of 1461, and the community had lost much of their stored food and livestock. When the harsh winter began, they were already weakened by the effects of war. The Welsh peasants had developed unique survival strategies that were adapted to their mountainous environment and the constant threat of warfare. Their longhouses were designed to be easily defended, with thick walls and few windows. They also maintained hidden stores of food and supplies in caves and other secret locations that could be accessed if their main dwellings were destroyed. When the extreme cold began in December 1461, Gwilym's family consolidated into the central hall of their longhouse. This room was heated by a large stone hearth that burned continuously, fed by a combination of wood, peat, and coal from local deposits. The family had learned to bank their fires carefully to maintain heat throughout the night while conserving fuel. The Welsh diet during winter was heavily dependent on preserved meats and dairy products. Gwilym's family had managed to hide some of their livestock from the raiders, and they had prepared for winter by smoking and salting meat, making hard cheeses, and preserving vegetables in salt and vinegar. They also gathered wild foods from the mountains, including nuts, berries, and edible roots. The family's survival strategy was complicated by the need to remain hidden from military forces that were moving through the area. They had to keep their fires small and avoid creating smoke that might attract attention. They also had to be prepared to evacuate their home quickly if they were threatened by soldiers from either side of the conflict. The Welsh peasants had developed a sophisticated system of communication that allowed them to share information about both weather conditions and military movements. They used horn signals and smoke signals to warn neighbouring villages of danger, and they maintained a network of messengers who could travel quickly through the mountains even in harsh weather. The winter of 1461 to 1462 was made more dangerous by the presence of bandits and deserters who preyed on isolated communities. Gwilym's village had to maintain armed guards throughout the winter, which strained their resources and made survival more difficult. They also had to deal with refugees from other villages who had been destroyed by the war. The family's clothing was adapted to both the cold climate and the need for mobility. They wore multiple layers of wool and leather, with outer garments that could be quickly removed if they needed to flee. They also maintained sets of warm clothing in their emergency shelters, ensuring that they could survive even if forced to abandon their main dwelling. Water was a constant challenge in the Welsh mountains during winter. The family had to melt snow and ice for drinking water, but they also had to ensure that their water sources were not contaminated by the bodies of soldiers and animals that had died during the conflict. They developed filtration techniques using cloth and charcoal to purify water from questionable sources. The Welsh peasants had access to certain resources that were unique to their environment. They collected and burned coal from surface deposits, which provided more heat than wood and burned longer. They also used slate from local quarries to create heat-retaining surfaces around their fires, which helped warm their homes more efficiently. The family's survival during the winter was aided by their strong connections to the local religious community. The monks of Llanthony Priory provided food and shelter to peasant families during the worst of the winter, and they also served as neutral intermediaries who could negotiate with military forces on behalf of the local population. The psychological challenges of the Welsh winter were addressed through traditional bardic culture. Gwilym's family maintained their spirits through storytelling, poetry, and music that had been passed down through generations. These cultural practices provided not only entertainment, but also a way to preserve their identity and values during a time of extreme hardship. The winter of 1461 to 1462 claimed the lives of about half the population in Gwilym's region. But his family survived through a combination of careful preparation, community cooperation, and sheer determination. The experience led to changes in how Welsh communities prepared for both natural and human disasters, including the development of better hidden storage systems and more sophisticated communication networks. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, survival on the eastern frontier, 1564 to 1565. The winter of 1564 to 1565 in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was notable for its extreme severity and for the unique challenges faced by peasants living on the eastern frontier of European civilization. The Chronicle of Jan Długosz records this as the winter when the very air seemed to freeze and the wolves grew bold as armies. The story of Stanisław Kowal, a Polish peasant from a village near Lviv, modern-day Ukraine, provides insight into survival in a region where European and Asian cultures met and clashed. Stanisław's account survives in the records of the Monastery of the Holy Spirit in Lviv, where he sought refuge during the worst of the winter. Stanisław lived with his family in a log house that was typical of Polish peasant dwellings. The house was built with thick wooden walls and a steep roof designed to shed snow. It housed 12 people, his own family of 7, his brother's family of 3, and 2 elderly parents. The house was designed to be both fortress and home, with thick walls and small windows that could be shuttered during attacks. The Polish peasants on the eastern frontier faced unique challenges that combined extreme weather with the constant threat of Tatar raids. Their survival strategies had to account for both natural dangers and the possibility of sudden attacks by nomadic warriors. The community maintained a system of watchtowers and alarm signals that could warn of approaching raiders. The winter began with heavy snows in November 1564, but the real crisis came in December when a series of blizzards lasting for weeks trapped communities in their villages. Stanisław's account describes temperatures so low that spit would freeze before it hit the ground, and winds so strong that they could knock down trees and buildings. The family's survival strategy was based on the Polish tradition of winter sharing, where multiple families would consolidate into the warmest and most defensible houses during the worst weather. Stanisław's house became one of these centers because it was well built and had good stores of food and fuel. The Polish diet during winter was heavily dependent on preserved meats and fermented foods. Stanisław's family had prepared for winter by smoking and salting pork, making sauerkraut and other fermented vegetables, and brewing beer and mead that provided both nutrition and warmth. They also ate a lot of bread made from rye and barley, which was hearty and filling. The family's heating system was more sophisticated than those used in Western Europe. They had built a large masonry stove that could burn efficiently and retain heat for many hours. This type of stove, known as a piece, was common throughout Poland and provided better heat retention than the open hearths used in other regions. The Polish peasants had developed specialized techniques for dealing with the extreme cold of the Eastern European winter. They wore multiple layers of wool and fur, with outer garments made from sheepskin and bear hide. They also wore special boots lined with felt and fur that provided insulation against the frozen ground. Water was a constant challenge during the Polish winter. The family had to melt snow and ice for drinking water, but they also had to ensure that their water sources were not contaminated by the numerous bodies of animals and people that died during the harsh weather. They developed purification techniques using herbs and charcoal to clean their water supply. The winter of 1564 to 1565 was made more dangerous by the presence of wolves and other predators that were driven by hunger to attack human settlements. Stanisław's account describes several attacks on their village by wolf packs, which forced the community to maintain armed guards throughout the winter. They also had to protect their livestock from predators, which required constant vigilance. The Polish peasants had access to certain resources that were unique to their frontier environment. They collected and used amber for both trade and medicinal purposes, and they had access to furs and other products that could be traded for grain and other necessities. The proximity to trade routes between Europe and Asia provided opportunities for barter that were not available to peasants in more isolated regions. The family's survival during the winter was aided by their connections to both the Catholic Church and the Orthodox community. The religious diversity of the region meant that peasants could seek aid from multiple sources, and the different religious communities often cooperated during emergencies to ensure the survival of their shared communities. The psychological challenges of the Polish winter were addressed through a rich tradition of folk culture that included storytelling, music, and religious observances. Stanisław's family maintained their spirits through the celebration of traditional festivals and the practice of crafts that kept their hands and minds occupied during the long, dark months. The winter of 1564 to 1565 claimed the lives of an estimated 30% of the population in Stanisław's region, but his family survived through careful preparation and community cooperation. The experience led to improvements in how Polish communities prepared for winter, including the development of better storage techniques and more sophisticated heating systems. The Basque Country, maritime survival strategies, 1571 to 1572. The winter of 1571 to 1572 in the Basque Country was particularly challenging because it combined extreme cold with violent storms that made both fishing and trade impossible. The Chronicle of Oñati records this as the winter when the sea became solid and the mountains touched the sky with ice. The story of Mikel Etxeberria, a Basque fisherman from the coastal town of Getaria, illustrates how maritime communities survived when their connection to the sea was severed by ice and storms. Michael's account survives in the records of the sanctuary of Loyola, where he made a pilgrimage of thanksgiving after surviving the winter. Mikel lived with his extended family in a traditional Basque stone house that was built to withstand both harsh weather and potential attacks from pirates. The house sheltered 18 people, his own family of 8, his brother's family of 6, and 4 elderly relatives. The house was built with thick stone walls and a steep slate roof designed to shed snow and rain. The Basque peasants faced unique challenges because their economy was based on fishing and maritime trade. When the sea froze and storms made travel impossible, they were cut off from their primary sources of income and had to find new ways to survive. Their survival strategies had to be adapted to a coastal environment that was very different from the inland regions of Europe. The winter began with unusually violent storms in November 1571, followed by extreme cold that froze the coastal waters. Meikle's account describes ice extending far out to sea and waves that froze in place, creating a landscape that was both beautiful and terrifying. The family's fishing boats were trapped in ice, and their nets and equipment were destroyed by the storms. The family's survival strategy was based on the Basque tradition of etex, household cooperation, where all members of the extended family worked together for the common good. When fishing became impossible, the family turned to inland activities like hunting, gathering, and trading with mountain communities that had different resources. The Basque diet during winter was heavily dependent on preserved fish and dairy products. Meikle's family had prepared for winter by smoking and salting fish, making hard cheeses, and preserving vegetables in salt and vinegar. They also ate a lot of bread made from corn, which was more common in the Basque region than in other parts of Europe. The family's house was heated by a central fireplace that burned wood from the nearby mountains. However, the extreme weather made it dangerous to venture out for fuel, and the family had to ration their wood carefully. They also used charcoal and oil lamps to provide additional heat while conserving their primary fuel supply. The Basque peasants had developed unique clothing adapted to their maritime environment. They wore waterproof outer garments made from treated leather and wool, with special boots that provided traction on wet surfaces. During the winter crisis, they adapted these garments for extreme cold by adding additional layers of wool and fur. Water was less of a problem for the Basque peasants than for inland communities because they had access to springs and wells that did not freeze. However, they still had to deal with contamination from the numerous animals and people who died during the harsh weather. They used traditional Basque techniques for water purification, including boiling and filtration through sand and charcoal. The winter of 1571 to 1572 was made more dangerous by the presence of Spanish soldiers who were passing through the region on their way to campaigns in the Netherlands. The soldiers demanded food and shelter from the local population, which strained the resources of communities that were already struggling to survive. Meikle's family had to provide for soldiers while maintaining their own survival. The Basque peasants had access to certain resources that were unique to their environment. They collected and used seaweed for both food and fuel, and they had access to salt that could be used for preserving food and melting ice. The proximity to trade routes provided opportunities for barter that were not available to more isolated communities. The family's survival during the winter was aided by their strong connections to the Basque religious community. The region's numerous churches and monasteries provided food and shelter to peasant families during the worst of the winter, and they also served as centers for coordinating community survival efforts. The psychological challenges of the Basque winter were addressed through traditional cultural practices that included storytelling, music, and religious observances. The Basque language and culture provided a strong sense of identity that helped communities maintain their cohesion during times of extreme hardship. The winter of 1571 to 1572 claimed the lives of about 25% of the population in Michael's region, but his family survived through careful preparation and community cooperation. The experience led to changes in how Basque communities prepared for winter emergencies, including the development of better food storage techniques and more sophisticated heating systems. Conclusion: the enduring legacy of medieval resilience. These accounts of medieval peasant survival during the harshest winters in European history reveal not only the extraordinary resilience of ordinary people, but also the sophisticated strategies they developed to survive in conditions that would challenge even modern survival experts. From the frozen Thames of 1434 to the ice-bound lagoons of Venice in 1458, from the wolf-haunted mountains of Wales to the storm-lashed coasts of the Basque country, medieval peasants demonstrated a remarkable ability to adapt, innovate, and endure. The common threads that run through these diverse experiences speak to fundamental aspects of human nature and community organization. Successful survival required not just individual determination, but also strong social bonds, shared knowledge, and the willingness to make personal sacrifices for the common good. The peasants who survived the harshest winters were those who understood that survival was a collective endeavor, requiring cooperation, mutual support, and the pooling of resources and knowledge. These stories also reveal the importance of local knowledge and cultural adaptation. Each region developed survival strategies that were specifically adapted to local conditions, from the geothermal springs of Iceland to the coal deposits of Wales, from the maritime resources of the Basque country to the mountain caves of the Carpathians. This local knowledge was passed down through generations and continuously refined based on experience, creating a sophisticated understanding of how to survive in specific environments. The medieval peasant experience offers valuable lessons for modern times. In an era of climate change and increasing environmental challenges, the strategies developed by these medieval survivors provide insights into resilience, adaptation, and community cooperation. The enduring legacy of medieval resilience. The medieval period, spanning roughly from the 5th to the 15th centuries, stands as one of history's most challenging epochs. Yet within this era of constant upheaval, warfare, disease, and social transformation, humanity demonstrated an extraordinary capacity for resilience that continues to shape our world today. Through examining specific historical events and the responses they generated, we can trace how medieval communities, institutions, and individuals not only survived, but often thrived in the face of seemingly insurmountable challenges. The Black Death. Catalyst for social revolution. Perhaps no event better exemplifies medieval resilience than the response to the Black Death of 1347 to 1351. This pandemic, which killed an estimated 1/3 of Europe's population, could have marked the end of medieval civilization. Instead, it became a catalyst for profound social and economic transformation that would ultimately strengthen European society. In Florence, one of the hardest hit cities, the wealthy merchant Giovanni Villani initially chronicled the plague's devastation before succumbing to it himself. His brother Matteo continued the chronicle, documenting how the city's survivors reorganized their society. The massive population loss created labor shortages that fundamentally altered the feudal system. Peasants, suddenly in high demand, could negotiate better wages and working conditions. the rigid social hierarchy that had defined medieval Europe for centuries began to crack. In England, the plague's aftermath saw the emergence of new forms of social organisation. The Statute of Labourers, enacted in 1351, attempted to freeze wages at pre-plague levels, but enforcement proved nearly impossible. Villages like Warren Percy in Yorkshire saw their entire social structure transformed as surviving peasants abandoned their traditional holdings to seek better opportunities elsewhere. This mobility, previously restricted by feudal obligations, became a new norm that would eventually contribute to the development of a more flexible economic system. The city of Siena provides a particularly striking example of institutional resilience. When the plague struck in 1348, the city's government, the Council of Nine, initially collapsed as members fled or died. Rather than descending into chaos, the remaining citizens quickly formed new governing bodies. The Sienese adapted their famous system of rotating magistrates to accommodate the reduced population, creating smaller but more efficient administrative units. This flexibility allowed the city to maintain essential services and begin reconstruction efforts even while the plague still raged. Religious institutions also demonstrated remarkable adaptability. The monastery of Saint-Denis near Paris lost nearly half its monks to the plague. Yet under Abbot Gilles de Pontoise's leadership, it transformed its operations. The abbey began accepting more lay brothers, modified its agricultural practices to require less labour, and even started manufacturing activities to generate income. These changes not only ensured the monastery's survival, but made it more economically robust than before the plague. The Mongol invasions, Eastern Europe's test of endurance. The Mongol invasions of the 13th century presented another existential challenge that tested medieval resilience. The destruction was unprecedented. Entire cities were razed, and populations were decimated. Yet the responses to these invasions reveal remarkable examples of adaptation and recovery. In 1240, Kiev, the jewel of the Kievan Rus, fell to Batu Khan's forces. The city was so thoroughly destroyed that travelers reported seeing only a few hundred houses where once a great metropolis had stood. However, the survivors didn't simply abandon the region. Instead, they established smaller settlements along the Dnieper River, creating a network of communities that could more easily evacuate when threatened. This dispersed settlement pattern, born from necessity, actually made the region more resilient to future invasions. The Hungarian response to the Mongol invasion of 1241 to 1242 exemplifies strategic resilience. After the devastating defeat at the Battle of Mohi, King Bela IV didn't simply rebuild the old system. Instead, he initiated a comprehensive reform program. He invited foreign settlers, particularly Germans, to repopulate devastated areas, bringing new agricultural techniques and crafts. He also began constructing a network of stone castles to replace the wooden fortifications that had proved inadequate against Mongol siege techniques. The city of Buda was relocated to a more defensible position on Castle Hill, a move that would define the city's character for centuries to come. Perhaps most remarkably, the Mongol invasions led to technological and military innovations that strengthened medieval Europe. The shock of facing an enemy with superior mobility and coordination forced European military leaders to rethink their strategies. The development of crossbow technology accelerated, and new forms of cavalry tactics emerged. The fortification techniques learned from defending against Mongol siege weapons later proved invaluable in other conflicts. The Russian principalities demonstrated extraordinary resilience in adapting to Mongol rule. Prince Alexander Nevsky of Novgorod exemplified this pragmatic approach. Rather than engaging in futile resistance, he chose to work within the Mongol system while maintaining his people's cultural and religious identity. He traveled to the Mongol capital of Karakorum, secured favorable terms for his principality, and used his relationship with the Mongols to protect his territory from Western crusaders. This strategy of accommodation, while preserving essential identity, became a model for survival that many Russian communities followed. The Viking Age, transformation through conflict. The Viking Age, roughly 793 to 1066 CE, presents a fascinating study in how medieval communities adapted to sustained external pressure. The initial Viking raids on monasteries like Lindisfarne in 793 CE shocked the Christian world, but the long-term response demonstrated remarkable resilience and adaptation. The monastery of Iona, repeatedly raided between 795 and 825 CE, provides an excellent example of institutional adaptation. Rather than abandoning the site, the monks developed a system of valuable manuscript preservation. They created portable religious artifacts that could be quickly evacuated, established satellite communities inland where treasures could be hidden, and developed networks with other monasteries for mutual protection. The famous Book of Kells, produced during this period, represents not just artistic achievement, but also the development of new techniques for creating and preserving cultural treasures under threat. The Anglo-Saxon kingdom's response to Viking invasions transformed the political landscape of Britain. King Alfred the Great of Wessex, 871 to 899 CE, didn't simply fight the Vikings. He fundamentally reorganized Anglo-Saxon society to better resist them. He established the burh system, a network of fortified towns that provided both military strongpoints and economic centers. Each burh was strategically located so that no part of Wessex was more than 20 miles from a fortified position. This system required unprecedented cooperation between different social classes and regions, creating a more unified and resilient kingdom. The establishment of the Danelaw in northern and eastern England demonstrates how medieval societies could adapt to and eventually integrate with their conquerors. Rather than perpetual conflict, many Anglo-Saxon communities found ways to coexist with Viking settlers. The legal system that emerged in these areas combined Anglo-Saxon and Norse traditions, creating hybrid institutions that proved remarkably durable. Towns like York, Jorvik, became thriving commercial centers where Anglo-Saxon and Viking merchants worked together, creating new forms of economic organization. In Ireland, the response to Viking raids led to significant political and military innovations. The Irish kings, traditionally focused on cattle raiding and local conflicts, began cooperating on a larger scale to resist Viking incursions. The Battle of Tara in 980 CE, where the High King Brian Boru defeated the Vikings, was possible only because of new forms of political alliance and military organization that had developed in response to the Viking threat. These innovations ultimately contributed to the brief unification of Ireland under Brian Boru's rule. The Crusades, religious fervor and practical adaptation. The Crusades, 1095 to 1291 CE, represent one of medieval Europe's most ambitious undertakings, requiring unprecedented levels of organization and resource mobilization. The logistics of moving hundreds of thousands of people across continents, sustaining them in hostile environments, and coordinating military campaigns across vast distances demanded innovations that would have lasting impact. The First Crusade, 1095 to 1099 CE, succeeded largely due to the adaptive capacity of its participants. When the People's Crusade, led by Peter the Hermit, ended in disaster, the subsequent military leaders learned from these failures. Godfrey of Bouillon, Raymond of Toulouse, and other commanders developed new systems for managing large armies over long distances. They established regular supply lines, created diplomatic protocols for negotiating with Byzantine and Muslim rulers, and developed new siege techniques suited to Eastern fortification. The establishment of the Crusader states in the Levant required even greater adaptability. The Kingdom of Jerusalem, founded in 1099, couldn't simply transplant European feudal structures to the Middle East. Instead, rulers like Baldwin I and Baldwin II created hybrid systems that incorporated elements of Byzantine, Islamic, and Western European governance. The Assizes of Jerusalem, a legal code developed for the Crusader states, combined French feudal law with local customs and practical necessities of governing a diverse population. The military orders, the Knights Templar, Hospitallers, and Teutonic Knights, represent perhaps the most innovative institutional responses to the challenges of the Crusades. These organizations combined religious devotion with military efficiency and economic sophistication. The Templars, for instance, developed an international banking system that allowed pilgrims to deposit money in Europe and withdraw it in the Holy Land, reducing the risks of carrying large amounts of cash across dangerous territories. This system became a model for later financial institutions. The fall of Acre in 1291 and the end of the Crusader states might seem like failure, but the response of the military orders demonstrates medieval resilience. Rather than simply disbanding, they adapted their missions. The Hospitallers relocated to Rhodes and later Malta, where they continued their mission of defending Christianity while developing new roles as naval defenders of the Mediterranean. The Teutonic Knights shifted their focus to the Baltic, where they played a crucial role in the Christianization and colonization of Prussia and the Baltic states. The Great Famine, agricultural innovation and social adaptation. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1322 tested medieval Europe's food production and distribution systems to their limits. This 7-year period of crop failures, caused by unusually cold and wet weather, resulted in widespread starvation and social upheaval. Yet the responses to this crisis led to important innovations in agriculture and social organization. In the Low Countries, where the famine was particularly severe, communities developed new approaches to land management. The Dutch began their famous system of dike construction and land reclamation, turning necessity into opportunity. When traditional agricultural areas became waterlogged and unproductive, they developed techniques for creating new arable land from marshes and coastal areas. The technological innovations required for this work, improved drainage systems, new tools for moving earth, A more sophisticated understanding of hydraulic engineering would later make the Netherlands one of Europe's most prosperous regions. The city of Ghent provides a detailed example of urban resilience during the famine. As food supplies dwindled, the city's governing council implemented a series of innovative measures. They established price controls on essential goods, created public works projects to provide employment for the unemployed, and developed new trade relationships with distant regions to import food. Most importantly, they began keeping detailed records of population, food supplies, and economic conditions, creating some of medieval Europe's first systematic municipal statistics. These records not only helped them manage the immediate crisis, but provided valuable information for future planning. Monastic communities again demonstrated remarkable adaptability. The Abbey of Saint-Bertin in northern France, faced with the failure of its traditional agricultural system, began experimenting with new crops and farming techniques. They introduced new varieties of grains better suited to cold, wet conditions, developed improved storage methods to preserve food longer, and established more extensive networks for sharing resources with other religious houses. These innovations spread throughout the monastic system, contributing to agricultural improvements across Europe. The 100 Years' War, military innovation and national identity. The 100 Years' War, 1337 to 1453, between England and France, represents one of medieval Europe's longest and most transformative conflicts. The war's duration and intensity forced both sides to develop new military technologies, administrative systems, and concepts of national identity that would define the early modern period. The English victory at Crécy in 1346 demonstrated the power of new military technologies and tactics. The longbow, used effectively by English and Welsh archers, revolutionized medieval warfare. However, the French response to this defeat shows remarkable resilience and adaptability. Rather than simply trying to match English archery, French military leaders like Bertrand du Guesclin developed new tactics that neutralized the longbow's advantages. They pioneered the use of heavy cavalry in coordinated charges, developed improved armor designs, and began using early firearms more effectively. The Siege of Orléans in 1428 to 1429 and its relief by Joan of Arc illustrates how medieval communities could mobilize in the face of seemingly hopeless situations. The city's defenders, led by Jean de Dunois, had already demonstrated remarkable ingenuity in their defense. They developed new siege techniques, created underground networks for communication and supply, and maintained morale through 8 months of bombardment. Joan's arrival provided the psychological boost needed for victory, but the military and logistical foundation for that victory had been laid by the defenders' sustained resilience. The development of professional armies during this period represents a fundamental shift in medieval military organization. The English system of indenture contracts, which replaced feudal military service with professional soldiers, created more reliable and skilled forces. The French responded by developing their own professional military units, including the famous Compagnie d'Ordonnance established by Charles VII. These innovations not only changed military practice, but also created new forms of state organization and tax collection. The Islamic world, preservation and innovation. While focusing on Christian Europe, it's crucial to acknowledge the extraordinary resilience demonstrated by Islamic civilization during the medieval period. The Islamic world faced many of the same challenges as Europe: invasions, disease, economic disruption, but responded with innovations that preserved and extended human knowledge. The Mongol destruction of Baghdad in 1258 eliminated one of the Islamic world's greatest centers of learning. The House of Wisdom, which had preserved and translated Greek, Persian, and Indian texts for centuries, was destroyed. However, the intellectual traditions it represented didn't disappear. Scholars fled to other centers like Cairo, Cordoba, and Damascus, carrying their knowledge with them. The Ayyubid and later Mamluk rulers of Egypt actively recruited these refugee scholars, creating new institutions that continued the work of preservation and translation. The career of Ibn Khaldun, 1332 to 1406, exemplifies this intellectual resilience. Born in Tunisia during a period of political fragmentation and conflict, he served various rulers across North Africa and Spain. His masterwork, the Muqaddimah, synthesized centuries of Islamic scholarship while introducing new methods of historical analysis. Despite the political instability of his time, Ibn Khaldun created one of the medieval world's most sophisticated works of social science. In Al-Andalus, Islamic Spain, the Christian Reconquista created constant pressure on Islamic communities. Yet these communities demonstrated remarkable adaptability. The Mudejar population, Muslims living under Christian rule, developed new forms of cultural expression that blended Islamic and Christian elements. They created architectural styles like the Mudejar style, which combined Islamic geometric patterns with Christian symbolic elements. This cultural synthesis, born from necessity, created artistic traditions that influenced both Islamic and Christian art for centuries. Technological innovation through adversity. Medieval resilience often manifested through technological innovation driven by necessity. The constant warfare, natural disasters, and economic challenges of the period forced medieval peoples to develop new tools and techniques that would have lasting impact. The development of the heavy plough represents a crucial agricultural innovation that emerged from the need to cultivate the heavy clay soils of Northern Europe. This technology, combined with the three-field system and improved harnesses for draft animals, dramatically increased agricultural productivity. These innovations weren't developed in isolation, but emerged from the practical needs of communities trying to feed growing populations in challenging environments. The evolution of castle architecture demonstrates how military pressures drove technological advancement. The Motte and Bailey castles of the early medieval period proved inadequate against improved siege techniques. Engineers responded by developing concentric castle designs with multiple layers of defense and sophisticated techniques for withstanding prolonged sieges. Castles like Caerphilly in Wales and Crac des Chevaliers in Syria represent sophisticated responses to military challenges that required unprecedented engineering skills. The development of mechanical clocks in the 13th and 14th centuries emerged from the practical needs of monastic communities trying to regulate prayer times and daily activities. These timepieces, initially crude by modern standards, represented a fundamental shift in how humans understood and organized time. The precision required for their construction led to advances in metalworking, gear cutting, and mechanical engineering that would later contribute to the development of more complex machinery. Economic resilience and commercial innovation. Medieval economic systems demonstrated remarkable adaptability in the face of disruption. The collapse of the Western Roman Empire could have meant the end of large-scale commerce in Europe. Instead, medieval merchants and craftsmen developed new forms of economic organization that would ultimately prove more flexible and robust than their Roman predecessors. The development of the Hanseatic League represents one of medieval Europe's most successful economic innovations. Faced with the dangers of long-distance trade, piracy, political instability, and unreliable legal systems, merchants from northern German cities created a confederation that could protect their interests across the Baltic and North Sea regions. The League developed standardized weights and measures, established uniform legal procedures for commercial disputes, and created a network of trading posts that facilitated commerce across vast distances. The Italian city-states pioneered many financial innovations that would become fundamental to modern capitalism. The development of double-entry bookkeeping, credit instruments, and early forms of insurance all emerged from the practical needs of merchants trying to manage complex commercial operations. The Medici Bank, established in Florence in the 15th century, created a network of branches across Europe that could facilitate international trade and currency exchange on an unprecedented scale. The rise of medieval guilds represents another form of economic resilience. These organizations emerged to protect craftsmen from competition and ensure quality standards, but they also provided social safety nets for their members. Guilds established funds for supporting widows and orphans, created training programs for young craftsmen, and provided forums for resolving disputes. This system of mutual support helped medieval communities weather economic downturns and social disruptions. The legacy of medieval resilience. The resilience demonstrated by medieval peoples in the face of extraordinary challenges created patterns of adaptation and innovation that continue to influence our world today. The institutional frameworks they developed, universities, representative governments, professional armies, commercial networks, formed the foundation for modern civilization. Perhaps most importantly, medieval resilience demonstrated that human societies can not only survive catastrophic challenges, but can emerge stronger from them. The Black Death led to social changes that ultimately improved the lives of ordinary people. The Viking invasions forced innovations in military organization and state building. The Crusades, despite their ultimate failure, created new forms of international cooperation and cultural exchange. The medieval period teaches us that resilience isn't simply about returning to previous conditions after a crisis. True resilience involves adaptation, innovation, and the willingness to create new systems when old ones prove inadequate. The medieval peoples who faced the collapse of the Roman Empire, the devastation of plague, the terror of invasion, and the challenges of climate change didn't simply endure. They created new forms of civilization that would shape the future. This legacy of adaptive resilience remains relevant today as we face our own unprecedented challenges. Climate change, technological disruption, and social transformation require the same kind of creative adaptation that medieval peoples demonstrated. Their example shows us that even the most severe challenges can become opportunities for positive change. if we maintain the flexibility to adapt our institutions and practices to new circumstances. The enduring legacy of medieval resilience lies not in any specific institution or practice they created, but in their demonstration that human societies possess an extraordinary capacity for adaptation and renewal. In their response to crisis, they showed us that resilience isn't about rigid resistance to change, but about the creative flexibility to transform challenges into opportunities for growth and improvement. This lesson, written in the achievements of medieval civilization, remains as relevant today as it was 1,000 years ago.